You are listening to Over and Back's Basketball Mysteries of the 1970s. Today's mystery is, how did Spencer Haywood change everything? Welcome to Over and Back. I am Jason, and this is part 2 of my conversation with Reinis Lacis of the Handle podcast, talking about the battles off the court between the ABA and the NBA. In the first part, we talked about the formation of the ABA, the first antitrust suit, and some of the early battles between the two leagues. This episode, we're going to talk about Spencer Haywood and his revolutionary case and how it changed player rights in the country, as well as the ABA and NBA coming very close to a merger before the Oscar Robertson lawsuit derailed that, and much more. So check it out. But first, we want to tell you about our sponsor, The Replay with L and Al. Have you ever wondered how your favorite NBA players spend their time off the court? If so, The Replay with L and Al is a perfect podcast for you. They discuss everything from endorsement deals and power couples to fashion choices and social media. Listen in every week, and we promise you'll be hipper than Joel Embiid's pregame dance routines. Check out The Replay on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, or check it out at the Step Back. And now Reinis and I are joined in progress discussing Spencer Haywood. So the NCAA had a 4-year rule preventing players from leaving for the pros until the class graduated. Of course, other sports like baseball, golf, and tennis, players were free to play coming out of high school, which everyone kind of saw the hypocrisy in that, but this was just the way that the system was set up, and a lot of people defend it. Some people defend it still. So Denver signed Haywood, who was a sophomore from the University of Detroit. He had been dominant in college. He also had helped the U.S. To a gold medal in 1968 with a fairly weakened team. There were a lot of the top black athletes did not play on that team. He kind of came out of nowhere and led that team, and it was extremely dominant. The ABA sort of formulated an argument that Haywood was a hardship case and didn't needed to earn money sooner than after his college class to support his mother and 9 siblings, to kind of make this somewhat palatable to the general public who would feel like who would be against this, who would feel like this is the idea of the professionals taking advantage of the college players, and all that amateurism that's sort of baked into this argument. That at least gave them some justifiable cover for that system, even though, as we'll see, even they admitted that it was pretty much a sham.
Yeah, a lot of people involved in this, and it's still similar to this day when we talk about NCAA and player compensation. Many of them come off as being flat out wrong, hypocritical, or on the contrary, they did admirable deeds like Al McGuire did when it comes to Terry Pluto's book, Loose Balls, and the stories described there. But what I wanted to bring up was the boss move George Mikan pulled off when he contacted the NCAA Coaches Association and said he would make information he had from his teammate from his players in the league, the information they had given them about scholarships and then the payoffs they had been given cars, and that Mikan threatened that he would make this information public if they didn't back off, and right after that the letter that was given out that ABA people were banned from campuses was withdrawn. So a lot of people were involved in this scandal, and when reading it like 40 years later, you notice that some were in it for their own good, and some realized the larger issue at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. So Haywood was, he was the MVP and Rookie of the Year in 1970. Was a dominant player in the league, absolutely ready for the ABA, and would jump to the NBA soon, and would be, for the next 4 or 5 years, would absolutely be would be an all-star and an all-NBA caliber player. So he wanted, in early 1970, he asked Denver to renegotiate his contract because there was a lot of deferred money in it. And we'll get to the Dolgoff Plan and deferred money, kind of explain that in just a little bit. But he and Denver agreed to a 6-year deal totaling an estimated $1.9 million. And then later on in that summer, he consulted with an attorney, and then basically the contract didn't give what he thought it gave, and he gave written notice that he considered the contract to be invalid. And then in December of 1970, he signed a 6-year, $1.5 million with Seattle, despite the fact that the NBA considered him to be ineligible because his draft class had not graduated yet. So that was obviously a huge mess. And Haywood, he describes it as, "I was fighting a three-front war for a year. The NBA didn't want me to come play in their league. The ABA wanted to keep me in their league, and the NCAA was mad because they knew they'd be hurt if I won."
Yeah, and he was absolutely worth the fight. His rookie year never stops astounding me. First off, he clocked 3,808 minutes for the season. The only other person to play more than 3,800 was Wilt, who did it 3 times. And then in the playoffs, his playing time went up from 45 minutes to 47 minutes per game, as did his contributions on the court. He averaged an insane 36.7 points and almost 20 rebounds per game. And that just speaks perfectly to how ready he actually was for professional basketball, to play basically without any rest for 84 games at the age of 20 and post those numbers and help the team to probably its best season in franchise existence before Larry Brown and crew came along. It's very impressive, and he rightfully was overmatched with the Denver team by the Los Angeles Stars in the division finals, and we don't need to get into that. But yeah, that first round clash between Haywood and Rick Barry is one of the many reasons why not having ABA footage sucks, because a 7-game series of Haywood averaging 36 and Barry putting up 40, I wish I could see one of those games. So when you have that in mind, you can understand why everybody wanted a say in this, because Spencer Haywood was really good in his rookie year.
Yeah, not to mention, I believe there's a notorious fight in Game 7 of that series where Rick Barry was, I believe, thrown out of the game, or was at least involved in in that. So there were a lot of heated tempers as well, and a lot of passion there, I guess you could say.
Yeah, as it usually was in any series involving Barry,
yes.
Or at least it seems so that every other series there was some fight.
Yes, yeah, the ABA and no one there was any stranger to fights for sure. So when Haywood is in Seattle, he was forced to miss a lot of games to attend hearings. I think he played something around like 35 games in that season. Every game that he went to, the crowds would burst into cheers after the PA announcer would say, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an illegal player on the floor, and the game cannot proceed with this illegal player on the floor." So every, there were dozens of protests of, games that he was involved in with the teams, protesting that it was, that they should invalidate the result because, he was doing this. The league sued Seattle from signing him. He eventually was given a temporary injunction to be able to play while, it went through the appeals court. And then finally, in March of 71, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Haywood's favor, allowed him to remain in the NBA, and then cleared the way for underclassmen to be able to declare for the NBA draft. So really, obviously, a far-reaching case in terms of giving freedom of player movement and also freedom for the underclassmen to be able to declare for the draft for not having to wait till you're 22 years old. And then Denver and Haywood then reached an out-of-court settlement, clearing the way for him to remain in Seattle, where he did produce well. The team didn't have a lot of success, and he had a lot of clashing with Bill Russell, and ended up being traded and spiraling down, unfortunately, as he dealt with drug issues and other things in the late 70s. But he certainly was a important transcendent player, really, in a lot of ways a reflection of kind of a lot of what the 70s were all about in terms of pro basketball.
Yeah, and the person who deserves a footnote in all of this mess, when looking back at some of these recruiting wars, is Agent Al Ross, who helped Spencer. He later on helped guys like Jim McDaniels and Charlie Scott jump leagues, and it almost seemed like extortion. He'd take a young star who was suddenly unhappy with his contract for one reason or another, and he went to the owner to renegotiate a new one, which consisted of heavy demands. So there's some of them even silly, like asking for an immediate 50 grand bonus for Jim McDaniels for the aggravation of having to live in North Carolina. So when you consider his role in all of this, another one of the movers and shakers who played a huge role and perhaps messed up a career of a young guy who was at that point only 20 or 21 years old, and suddenly he's booed in every NBA arena. So yeah, not the best look for guys like that.
No, because now, because of the the way the contracts, first, there's so much more money, and the way they're being structured, and the way that now players have more agency rather than just kind of accepting whatever the team that drafted them has to give them. Now they're, this is attracting agents out of the woodwork, some of whom are, reasonably ethical, many of whom are not. And there's a lot of accusations, some of it which have been, at least substantiated, that, agents were being paid under the table by the ABA for sending their clients there. I think there were similar accusations in the NBA as well. And, this is all sort of connected to what we talked about with the Dolgoff Plan and how it affected salaries. With the Dolgoff Plan was basically an ability for the ABA teams to pay salaries that looked really large, but only a small amount of it was in real cash. The other part of it, the majority of it in many cases, was in deferred payments that would go into a mutual fund that would start paying out 20, 25, 30 years into the future. So it was certainly, it was guaranteed in a sense, because it was a, there was I believe Prudential was an insurance company that was going to something where even if the ABA folded, it was money that was going into. But certainly in Haywood's case, he felt that he was not given a straight talk on how this would all work. And I wonder how many of the players, especially in the early years when the deferred money is a new thing, how much they knew what they were getting into. If their agents were leading them astray, or at a certain point, I think word would have had to get gotten out that a lot of these are the reason the money looks so good is because it's deferred payments.
Yeah, and moves like this, whether they were right or not, highlight how more business savvy and just considerate the ABA people were. I mean, they wouldn't have let someone of Dave Bink's caliber been grossly underpaid and unrespected by the owner of that respective team, and just so in a similar vein, they knew how to win these wars for players and offer them contracts which looked perhaps better than they actually were on paper, but which still looked good enough to sign.
Even if a lot of the money is deferred, you're still paying more than they were getting in the NBA contract. So maybe it's not as much as it seems, but it's still more than you're making now. So there's obviously an appeal to that. And Agent Ron Grinker in Loose Balls kind of illustrates what the issue would be, as the ABA paid in paper money, but the NBA responded to that by paying in real dollars, and it nearly bankrupted both leagues. And you can sort of look at the way that the salaries escalated from Curtis Harris of Pro Hoops History tweeted a chart out that in '68 in the NBA there were 4 players who had salaries of over $100,000. 3 seasons later in '71, it's 18 players who have over $100,000 a year, and the median salary goes from $25,000 to $40,000. And David Friedman at 22nd Timeout says that the average player salary rose from $35,000 in 1970 to $180,000 a decade later. However, franchise values also went up more than 600% during the same period. So as the salaries are getting larger, the franchise values are going up at an even higher rate. Now, that may not be evenly distributed throughout the leagues at the time. I mean, the Los Angeles Lakers and the New York Knicks, their franchise values may be going up much more than the Kansas City Kings were, but it's still the growth wasn't just in player salaries. The whole business was growing.
Yeah, I do wonder whether the NBA was simply reckless, or did they not know about the Dolgoff Plan, because it seems odd given the fact that the ABA knew so much about what was going on in the NBA and the inner workings of that league. So when Agent Ron Grinker said that line about the NBA responding to paying in real dollars, I do wonder what was the motivation behind that.
The ABA teams and executives sort of worked cooperatively to sort of get the players to the best situation that they could get, where the NBA teams were not really cooperating in that way. So I think that the fact that they weren't working collectively as much. They were bidding against each other more, where the ABA players, the ABA teams weren't necessarily doing that as much with players. And yeah, I mean, I know the Dolgoff Plan was secret for a while. I also wonder if there were NBA rules that were collectively bargained with the union that probably limited the amount of deferred compensation that they could do. I know later on in the late 70s and early 80s, there are issues with players being owed deferred compensation, and some teams are in serious financial trouble because of that. But I don't know if maybe the rules of the NBA limited the amount of deferred compensation that you could have at the time. I couldn't really actually find out anything for that specifically.
Yeah, I guess so. Those two both are good points, especially when we'll talk about David Thompson later on. But when the attitude in the ABA was that I believe Virginia had the rights for him, and then when they found out that Denver had contacted David and then basically was ready to sign him out of college, Virginia's reaction was, "Oh, that's really great. Yeah, you go at him and have him." And when nothing like that could have happened in the NBA, where you're bidding against each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So August of 1969, Rick Barry, he signs a 5-year deal with the Warriors, but he's prevented from jumping back after a legal battle. However, he does eventually force his way out of. He plays a year in Washington and then forces his way from Virginia to the New York Nets, where he actually ends up being happy. But then, as that contract does take effect with the Warriors eventually, after he resolves his ABA contract, he ends up going back to the NBA, and he's, I think, okay with it because he did sort of want to play with the Warriors, but it was sort of an instance where every time that Barry wanted to play in one team, he ended up having to go to the team that he didn't want to play for. Like he has like 4 consecutive years where he's wants to play in one place, but there's a legal maneuver that keeps him from going to the place that he wants to go, and he ends up going to a different place. So it's just very emblematic of what was going on at the time.
Yeah, he has the weirdest career arc of any superstar, I guess, because he followed up the year of averaging 35 points at the age of 22 with announcing for a year, playing for the Oakland Oaks, who won the title without him because he injured his knee, and then changing a team effectively. Although the Washington, I guess, was the same franchise, he effectively played for 2 other teams the next 2 seasons. Then, so, of course, some stars have injury problems in their early 20s, like Derrick Rose or Penny Hardaway, and some get off the tracks for other reasons. But the Rick Barry career arc is really a unique one.
Yeah, for a guy who's in top 25, top 30 all time, that is a unusual situation. And really only could have happened, right around this time with just the way that things were changing. Things sort of stabilized later, where players were, pretty much going to stay with their original team for at least 5-6 years, unless under extraordinary circumstances. But in any case, sort of a funny aspect to this NBA ABA war is the ABA decides to go after 4 of the best referees in the NBA: Earl Strom, John Vanek, Norm Drucker, and Joe Gushu. Gave them a whole lot more money and a whole lot more bonuses, and and offering health insurance and a pension plan, which they didn't have in the NBA. So it really was an interesting move to go. I mean, I don't really know how much of a difference it made. I mean, it helped the quality of play and the quality of the officiating. Everyone talked a lot about how much of a difference it made with these guys and how it did hurt the NBA in that way. But it's more of an interesting footnote than anything that particularly mattered in the long haul. But just as a just as how these fights come over what end up being relatively small, petty things, was just another way that the ABA was able to stick it to the NBA and also improve the quality of its refereeing.
Yeah, I do hope that the motivation for this, at least to some degree, was just trying to rub it into the NBA and still start stealing referees when they were least expecting it.
So, January 1970, the sides resume merger talks, but they do break down. NBA announces expansion instead. Basically, the major issues were the players' union was against publicly against the merger at this point. The NBA union, and also there was some issues with deciding to do with what the players who had jumped or who had announced jumps to the ABA, which included Barry, Zemel Beatty, Dave Bing, Billy Cunningham, and Luke Jackson. How to settle the antitrust suits, how much it would cost to get in the league, lots of things. So February of 70, there's also more merger talks. April of 70, there are reports that the merger agreement is near. They say the terms were the ABA would keep a separate entity for at least 3 years before official merger and realignment. There would be a championship series between the ABA and NBA champions. The ABA would pay $11.25 million to join the league. I believe it was 10 teams, everybody but Virginia was included in that. And this is the point in which 14 NBA players file what is known as the Oscar Robertson lawsuit to block the merger on antitrust grounds to do away with the reserve clause.
Yeah, and this would be quite the different history in regards to both leagues if all would have happened so successfully and so easily. And it's literally pretty much impossible to imagine given the things we know about the ABA's history and how the league had to carry on for another few years. So everything ending happily in 1973 seems odd from at least from my standpoint.
Sure. So the votes are actually in June of 1970. The NBA votes 13-4 in favor of the merger. ABA's 11 to nothing. And the ABA only would have paid $1.25 million over 10 years, which obviously was a much better deal than they ended up getting in 76. They were, of course, all in favor of it. It was the players' union that blocked it, and rightfully so. They got to do away with the reserve clause and were able to enhance their rights, through that lawsuit. But it would have been interesting in a basketball sense to go back and see what would have happened with a merged NBA ABA league at that time. Although you miss out, there's so much, of course, great things in the ABA itself that you probably would have been missed out on. Julius Erving, he probably wouldn't have been signed right out of. He wouldn't have gone in the situation that he went into, and he's obviously lots of things that would have changed because of that. So I'm glad the history is the way that it was, but it still is interesting to kind of look back and come up with alternative scenarios of how things would have been in if the merger occurred then.
Yeah, and I suppose much more ABA players would be Hall of Famers by now, but who knows? I also prefer the way of ABA going on for a few years, because that definitely seems like a lot more fun.
Yes, yeah. Although I suppose the ABA that would have existed with the NBA may have had a slightly more television coverage, which but still, I think the legend that it created was better than anything we could have seen, perhaps. So 1970 was a stacked draft. The consensus All-Americans, the NBA, they got Bob Lanier, Pete Maravich, Calvin Murphy, and Jimmy Collins. The ABA, with its strongest grab, Dan Issel, Rick Mount, and Charlie Scott. Other notable players for the NBA: Rui Tomjanovich, Dave Cowens, Tiny Archibald, Sam Lacey, and Jeff Petrie. And for the ABA, Billy Paltz, Jim Ard, who was the number 6 overall pick in the NBA, and Ralph Simpson. So a lot of these players, that went to the ABA would have been high picks, but it was pretty well known that they were already going to the ABA. Like Dan Issel, for instance, was picked in the second round, and he would have been very likely a top 5 pick had it not been for the realization that he wanted to go to Kentucky, and that NBA teams were aware that they picking him in the first round would have been a waste of a pick. So the actual, and until we get into like 74, 75, the actual number of times in which a really highly picked player ends up in the NBA, ends up going into the ABA is relatively low because usually they had a good sense ahead of time of whether they were going to come to the NBA or not.
Yeah, Dan Issel had that Kentucky connection, and I guess it was pretty well known that he was leaning to go to the Colonels. Then out of this group of guys, Charlie Scott is the one who doesn't necessarily associate with the ABA, at least for me, because of the way he jumped over. So that's one of the guys who the ABA lost pretty early, and again thanks to the same agent, Jim Ross. Oh, excuse me, Al Ross. Yeah,
not the wrestling announcer Jim Ross, but
certainly not.
So October 1970, Carolina signed Atlanta's Joe Caldwell. Rich and I did an episode looking at Caldwell and Cunningham, along with Wilt Chamberlain and some other NBA stars' time in the ABA. So it didn't necessarily go that well, but that was a fairly significant get for the Cougars at the time. Another former Hawk who was not happy with the situation in St. Louis/Atlanta and ended up leaving. And then in November 1970, the NBA announced it was ending efforts to get the merger approved in Congress. So with the Oscar Robertson lawsuit hanging along the lines, and with the issues going on there, that is held off for a while. December 1970, as we mentioned, Spencer Haywood officially jumping to Seattle and signing that contract. January 1971, Billy Cunningham tries to get out of his Cougars contract before he even signs it because of a missed payment. The courts end up ruling in favor of Carolina, and he has to go there for the next season. Also in that month, ABA commissioner, the new commissioner, Jack Dolph, who replaced George Mikan, who was signed because of his connection to the television industry and was made commissioner in the hopes of getting a television deal, left his briefcase open during the 1971 All-Star Game, and reporters saw signed contracts for Jim McDaniels of Western Kentucky and Howard Porter of Villanova, who were two players in college basketball, and who were their teams, I believe, were going into the NCAA tournament that year. So certainly an embarrassment to have signed contracts for those guys who were still playing in college.
Yeah, Jack Dolph, apparently not hired as a commissioner because of his bookkeeping talents.
No.
We can certainly say that much.
No. So March of 71 is when the Supreme Court rules in favor of Haywood finally to be able to play in the league. May of 1971 is the first NBA ABA All-Star Game, which we talked about in our previous episode of looking at the on-the-court battles. The 1971 drafts, another strong one. Consensus All-Americans for the NBA: Austin Carr, Dean Meminger, Sidney Wicks, Ken Durrett, Curtis Rowe, and Howard Porter. For the ABA, most of these guys, again, not technically drafted, but signed with the league. Artis Gilmore, Jim McDaniels, John Roach, and Johnny Newman, who was only a sophomore. Other notable players, Elmore Smith, Randy Smith, and Freddie Brown. And for the ABA, Julius Erving, George McGinnis, and Darnell Hillman, who was the number 8 overall pick in the NBA. So, and a lot of those were, Erving, it was a signing as opposed to a draft, and the other players, or like I said, it may have been one of those secret drafts, but the ABA was always doing things like that. We're having secret drafts for players, and they were much looser and freer with the drafts than the NBA was.
Despite the quick downfall of Jim McDaniels and Johnny Newman in a way as well, I reckon this might be the first year where the ABA won the overall battle for talent. But between Julius Erving and Artis Gilmore and George McGinnis, I do believe that they have the overall better players here. Austin Carr had some bad injury luck, and then Randy Smith was a pretty good player as well, but they don't stand up against the guys ABA got.
Yeah. So June of 71, the NBA agrees to allow hardship cases into the draft. September of 71, the Senate subcommittee hearings on the merger begin. So even though they're not necessarily actively pursuing it. They're still, it's going on in Congress, and there are hearings. I know John Havlicek, Oscar Robertson testified. I'm sure many other players and NBA and ABA executives were part of them. I have not had a chance to dig deeply into the research on that. I am a basketball obsessive, but history obsessive, but not quite that deep as far as yet. September of 71 was the NBA had a hardship supplemental draft to allow a few players who were, hardship cases to be able to be drafted before they would fully be integrated in 72. The players who were drafted were Nate Williams to the Royals, who was a journeyman who managed to play 642 games without making the playoffs in his career, which is would be up there in the record. I know it's not the top, but it's would be among, I'm certainly the top 10 for a number of games without being in the playoffs at all. Next was Tom Payne of the Hawks, who was the first black player at the University of Kentucky, and he played 29 NBA games before he was arrested and later convicted of being a serial rapist, which is obviously unfortunate. Cyril Baptiste of the Warriors, he never played in the NBA because of a heroin addiction. Phil Chenier of the Bullets, who was a very good shooting guard for the Bullets, three-time All-Star, made 3 finals teams, and was really could have had a better career. He was felled by injuries right as hitting his prime around 27-28, and is now a broadcaster for the Wizards. And then finally, Joe Hammond with the Lakers, and he was a street ball legend, one of the greats in Rucker Park history. Supposedly didn't sign with the Lakers because he could make more money dealing drugs, and he later had I believe, an 11-year prison sentence for dealing drugs. So, not the best of luck for most of the guys on this list, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's odd how you can find sort of these unfortunate things that happen to all of them. Even Phil Chenier, who was a very good player, I just the first association I have with him is him announcing a bad Wizards performance and just being depressed over the fact that he is going through another season of this.
Yeah. September 1971 are the first interleague exhibition games that we talked about. The Players Union in the NBA also rejected a settlement offer to try to get that obstacle taken care of before they can do a merger. January 1972, and this isn't really related to the NBA and ABA, but I found it fascinating anyway. During Senate merger hearings, Senator Sergeant Shriver charges Royals owners Max and Jeremy Jacobs with ties to organized crime. They were also revealed to be illegally concealing ownership of a Las Vegas casino. Now, the Royals ended up selling it to a Kansas City group 2 months later after this. I will say there's a whole lot of interesting reading on this subject, including some much more contemporary things if you search for Max and Jeremy Jacobs, and I'll leave it at that. But that is something I never heard before, and quite a little bit of a fascinating thing.
Yeah, it sounds like I might be going down that rabbit hole tonight, because this is also the first time I have heard of this, and I had never heard about any organized crime ties in regards to NBA owners, so that's quite interesting.
That's the end of part 2. Thanks for checking us out. You can find us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We are part of the Step Back Network presented by Fansided, which you can find on iTunes and wherever you listen to your podcasts as well. Also on fansided.com. The Step Back can be found there. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook at Over and Back NBA. Stay tuned for part 3, which will be coming soon. We will talk about a secret plot between an NBA and ABA owner to destroy a secret contract by Bob McAdoo, signed illegally when he was in college. Also, we'll talk about how the ABA tried to woo Bill Walton and lots of other stuff. So keep checking us out. Goodbye.